Welcome to an introduction to AWS Identity and Access Management, also known as IAM. Hi, I'm Andy Cummings with AWS Training and Certification. I have been with AWS for going on a year and a half now, and I'm currently responsible for delivering live training events to AWS customers across North America. In this video, we'll start with a brief overview of IAM, get into some use cases. AWS Identity and Access Management enables you to securely control individual and group access to your AWS resources. Using IAM, you can create and manage AWS users, groups, and user permissions for your AWS services. IAM provides fine-grained control options and supports federated users or users outside of AWS by integrating with your company's Microsoft Active Directory or a third-party identity provider such as Facebook or Google, and having the authenticated users assume IAM roles. Let's go through a brief overview of the service and some of its use cases. Users have to be authenticated before they can access AWS services and resources. AWS services can be accessed via the AWS Management Console, AWS Command Line Interface, or through SDKs and APIs. You can create individual IAM users within your AWS account that correspond to users in your organization. Each user can have its own credentials for authenticating to AWS. IAM groups can also be created within your AWS account. As the number of users managing your AWS environment increases, it is helpful to manage permissions for multiple IAM users using IAM groups, which ensures that each member of the group will be provisioned with the same permission policy. After a user has been authenticated, they have to be authorized to access AWS services. By default, IAM users can't access anything in your account. You need to grant permissions to a user by creating a policy, which is a document in JSON format that explicitly lists permissions. An IAM policy is a document that defines the effect, actions, resources, and optional conditions for what API calls an entity can invoke. Any actions or resources that are not explicitly allowed are denied by default. Let's take a look at the sample policy we have on the screen. The first line of the policy describes who or what is being authorized. This could be a user, a group, or another resource within AWS. The action values describe which tasks are allowed to be performed. In this case, we have two API calls to Amazon S3. Next, we have the condition for this authorization to be successful. Only calls from the IP address listed here will have the designated permissions. Finally, the policy describes the resources to which the authorized tasks are to be performed. Getting started with IAM is very straightforward. Let's say your company has several departments that will be managing AWS services. The first step is to create an IAM group for each department. Using groups is highly recommended and the most efficient way to manage your users. The next step is to create a policy and assign it to the group. Any users added to this group will inherit those permissions. The final step is to create IAM users for each person in each department and add them to their respective groups. It is also important to mention that every AWS account has root-level credentials with full access to everything in the account. We recommend that you not use the root-level credentials for anything other than initial setup of the account and the creation of an IAM user account with administrative permissions attached via policy. IAM policies may also be assigned to an IAM role. An IAM role is similar to a user in that it is an AWS identity with permissions that determine what the identity can and cannot do in AWS. A role does not have any long-term defined credentials, password, or access keys associated with it at all. Instead, if a user is assigned to a role, access keys are created dynamically and provided to the user temporarily. IAM roles can be used to delegate access to users, applications, or services that don't normally have access to your AWS resources. A user who assumes a role temporarily gives up his or her own permissions and instead takes on the permissions of the role, like wearing many hats in order to perform different tasks. So how can an IAM role be used in a real-world scenario? Well, let's say that you have a custom application that is hosted on an Amazon EC2 instance. This app needs to interact with objects stored in an S3 bucket. One way is to embed your AWS credentials in the application code, but doing so may compromise your credentials. Also, changing or rotating the credentials would require an update in the code each time. The alternative and more secure option is to use an IAM role to pass temporary security credentials as part of an instance profile. The application would use the identity assumed by the instance to access the Amazon S3 bucket. Another use case for IAM roles is to provide users, groups, or resources with permissions that they wouldn't usually have assigned to them. Here we have an IAM user that has an IAM policy with restricted access to an Amazon S3 bucket. This user does not normally need administrative privileges to this bucket. However, the user may sometimes have to perform tasks that require administrative privileges. For this purpose, a new IAM admin policy is created, then a new role is created, and the admin policy is attached to the role. When required, the user can be allowed to assume the IAM admin role and gain administrative access to the designated resource. When the user no longer needs to use the role, the original user permissions are restored. Leveraging IAM roles removes the need to modify a user's policy each time a change is required. Now let's summarize what we have learned so far. With AWS Identity and Access Management, you can create users and groups, assign them individual security credentials, or request temporary credentials via IAM roles to provide users access to AWS services and resources. IAM also enables you to use Identity Federation and allow existing entities in your enterprise to access AWS without the need to create an IAM account for each identity. I hope you learned a little something regarding AWS IAM and will continue to explore other videos. I'm Andy Cummings with AWS Training and Certification. Thanks for watching.